The Langford estate sat at the end of a dirt road no one bothered to pave, a place swallowed by pines that creaked like old bones in the wind. Outsiders rarely passed through, and those who did left quickly, unsettled by the unnatural quiet, the kind of silence that felt aware of you. Stories drifted through nearby towns about the family that had lived there for generations, always marrying within, always keeping their blood unbroken. Most dismissed it as rural gossip. But the truth was stranger and far older than anyone imagined. The discovery of the Langford blood ledger began the way most unsettling truths do, quietly, almost accidentally. The researcher had come to the region chasing the threads of old American family lines, but nothing prepared him for what he would find hidden in a crumbling farmhouse deep within the pines. He had been granted rare permission to examine the abandoned property of Judith Langford, the last officially recorded family member, whose estate had remained untouched since her disappearance decades earlier. Dust coated everything in a thick, gray film, the air stale and metallic as if time itself refused to move inside those walls. As he sifted through mold-rotted bookshelves and collapsed furniture, he noticed a warped board beneath the dining room cabinet that didn't sit flush with the rest of the floor. It looked pried at, almost worried over, as if someone had repeatedly checked and rechecked whatever lay underneath. Curiosity pushed him to pull it up, revealing a narrow cavity lined with old fabric that had long since decayed into threads. Inside was a thick book wrapped in oilcloth, its smell sharp even after so many years sealed away. It wasn't a diary or a Bible, though its size and weight resembled both. It was a ledger, a precise, almost clinical account of births, marriages, and deaths spanning more than 2 centuries. The ink, though faded, had a disturbing consistency, as if the same hand had written across generations. At first, he assumed it was just a family record, the kind many old families kept. But as he turned the pages, his stomach tightened. The pattern wasn't subtle. Nearly every name was linked by the same pairings. Cousins marrying cousins, first cousins almost exclusively. Notes written in margin tones of solemn obedience emphasized the rule passed down through each generation. The line must remain unbroken. Purity before all. Deviation invites ruin. The deeper he read, the more grotesque the tradition became. One page described the chastising of a daughter who tried to run away with someone from outside the family. Another coldly documented the punishment for a son who refused an arranged cousin marriage. The ledger did not treat these as tragedies or moral concerns. It presented them as necessary corrections, as if the family had been breeding toward a goal only they understood. Toward the back, the handwriting grew more frantic, more desperate, as though the writer sensed some approaching climax. The researcher realized he wasn't looking at a simple genealogical record. He was staring into a 200-year blueprint for something intentional, obsessive, and highly unnatural. The ledger had not been hidden to protect it from outsiders, but to protect outsiders from the truth it contained. The birth of the 11th generation child came into the world wrapped not in joy, but in a kind of watchful dread that hung heavy in the air long before the labor began. The Langfords had been preparing for this moment for more than a century, their rituals sharpened across generations like blades meant for a single purpose. Old letters tucked at the back of the ledger hinted that the family believed a perfect heir would eventually emerge from their relentless cousin marriage tradition, one who would embody everything the bloodline had been molded for. When the night finally arrived, a blood-red moon hung over the estate, bathing the collapsing rooftops and the surrounding pines in a strange, rust-colored glow. The midwife, a quiet woman from a neighboring village, later claimed the air inside the house felt thick, as if saturated with anticipation from unseen eyes. She noticed the way the elders watched the laboring mother, not with concern, but with reverence and fear, as if witnessing a prophecy they had half regretted fulfilling. When the child finally slid into the world, the midwife waited for a cry, a gasp, any fragile sign of human frailty. None came. The baby simply opened its eyes, large, dark, impossibly focused, and stared up at her with an intelligence that made her blood run cold. The skin was smooth, unervingly flawless, not a mark or wrinkle to suggest the strain of birth. Most children are scrunched, red, uncertain. This one looked carved, deliberate, as if sculpted rather than born. She tried to pinch the child's shoulder to test its response, but the infant didn't flinch. Instead, it blinked with the slow, precise motion of someone observing her reaction. The elders began whispering in tones of both awe and terror, repeating a phrase that the midwife couldn't understand fully but recognized from old folklore. A welcome reserved not for babies, but for something far older. What unsettled her most was the baby's silence. Not a fuss, not a whimper, not even the instinctual reflexive cry of breath entering new lungs. It simply tracked every movement around it, its gaze following her hands with a cold awareness that made her step back. The room felt colder with every passing second, as if the temperature dropped in recognition of the arrival. When the midwife lifted the child to clean it, she felt the slightest shift under her palms, like muscles tightening in a way that suggested control beyond infancy. And then, without warning, the child turned its head toward the darkest corner of the room, focusing on something, or someone, she could not see. The elders exchanged satisfied nods, as though the final expectation of their long, twisted lineage had been met. The midwife fled before dawn, refusing to return even when begged, because she knew with absolute certainty that whatever she delivered was not a miracle of biology, but a violation of it. The first incident began quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the way a house settles before a storm. For weeks after the birth of the 11th generation child, the Langford property seemed to hold its breath. The elders acted with a rigid, unsettling calm, the kind that comes not from peace but from bracing for something inevitable. They watched the infant constantly, not with affection but with a kind of ritualistic vigilance, as though waiting for a signal only they would recognize. The animals on the estate, however, sensed something long before any human did. Horses that had grazed on the land for decades began refusing to approach the barn where the child slept. Dogs that once slept soundly now growled at empty doorways, their hackles rising whenever the baby was carried past. Even the feral cats that lived beneath the porch scattered whenever the soft, cooing sounds drifted from the upstairs rooms. At first, the elders dismissed it all as coincidence, but the midwife's frantic departure still lingered in their minds, a warning they refused to fully acknowledge. The first true sign happened on a night when the air felt unnaturally still, as if the wind itself had chosen not to cross the Langford property. The family awoke to a silence so thick it felt almost suffocating. At dawn, one of the younger cousins walked toward the stable to feed the animals, only to stop dead in her tracks. Every creature inside, goats, chickens, rabbits, lay motionless on the ground. Their bodies showed no wounds, no signs of struggle. They looked as though life had been simply extracted from them with one swift, unseen gesture. What made the scene more terrifying was the way their bodies were positioned. Each animal was curled inward, limbs drawn close to its chest, spines arched unnaturally, as though something had twisted their posture from the inside. Their eyes were open and glassy, reflecting the pale morning light in a way that made them appear frozen mid-scream, even though their mouths never opened. The elders inspected the scene with grim understanding rather than shock. They exchanged looks that suggested recognition, something whispered about in the margins of the ledger but never spoken aloud. The younger family members, however, felt their stomachs knot with fear. The child had not cried all night. The child barely cried at all. When the mother brought the baby outside later that morning, something in the atmosphere shifted again. Birds that circled overhead veered sharply away, abandoning the sky above the property entirely. The infant watched the ground where the animals lay, eyes dark and unblinking, as if studying the aftermath of something it understood instinctively. The family buried the animals before sunset, but no one spoke of what they suspected. They wanted to believe it was some disease, some freak incident of nature. But as the days passed, similar deaths began occurring closer to the house. And the strange, suffocating silence that settled over the estate every night made one thing painfully clear. This was only the beginning. The moment the child spoke for the first time was not a milestone anyone celebrated. It was an event that left the Langford house trembling in a kind of silent terror because no one expected it to happen the way it did. Most babies take more than a year to form their first words. Some manage simple sounds earlier, but nothing meaningful. This child, however, had always been different. It rarely cried, rarely slept, and never behaved like an infant that needed comfort or reassurance. Instead, it watched everything with an unsettling attentiveness, its dark eyes following movements with a level of comprehension no newborn should possess. Still, even the most fearful elders did not expect what happened when the infant was barely 4 months old. It occurred one late afternoon when the family had gathered in the dim parlor lit only by the weak glow of oil lamps. The baby sat upright in its cradle without assistance, something the mother whispered about only in private. The room was tense. The deaths of the animals had shaken everyone, though no one dared speak it aloud. The silence was thick, the kind that made every breath sound too loud. Then, without warning, the baby inhaled deeply and let out a perfectly formed sentence. I remember all 10 of them. The words came out in a voice no one could mistake for a child's, a low, resonant tone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards and walls. The mother dropped the cloth she had been holding, her mouth hanging open. An uncle stumbled backward, knocking over a small table. One of the elderly aunts froze, her eyes filling with tears as if she had just seen a ghost. And in a way, she had. The room remained frozen in stunned disbelief as the baby continued looking at each person present with a calm, measured gaze, as though it were waiting to see who would speak first. The voice had sounded layered, as if multiple tones were woven into one. Those who heard it swore it carried the weight of years, not infancy. The phrase itself chilled them more deeply than the unnatural voice. All 10 of them, 10 generations, 10 ancestors who had shaped their bloodline. Each born under the same rules, each forced into the same lineage. The child's words weren't a coincidence. They were a declaration, a confirmation that something within the infant's mind held memories it was never born with. The elders exchanged anxious glances, recognizing the fulfillment of the prophecy scribbled in the final pages of the ledger, a prophecy they had pursued blindly without understanding its cost. The younger family members began whispering among themselves, trying to rationalize what they heard, but the truth pressed heavily on them. The baby didn't speak again that night, but every lamp in the house flickered as if reacting to a presence far older than the child in the cradle. And from that moment on, no one in the Langford household could bring themselves to look the infant in the eyes for too long, because every time they did, they felt as though someone else entirely was looking back. The archivist's warning emerged slowly, like a splinter working its way to the surface of old skin. It began when the researcher, already disturbed by what he had uncovered in the Langford ledger, learned of a name repeatedly mentioned in the older margins, Elias Hartwell, a local historian who had disappeared nearly 70 years earlier. His notes, rumored to be hidden somewhere in the county archive, had long been dismissed as obsessive rural fantasies. Yet the more the researcher read, the more he sensed that Hartwell had been the only outsider who understood what the Langfords were trying to achieve. After days of combing through boxes in the dusty basement of the town records building, the researcher found a bundle of papers tied with brittle twine. The label on the top sheet read, in faded ink, "For those who come after." They must be told. Inside were Hartwell's handwritten observations, each page warped by time and the dampness that clung to the stone walls. Hartwell had spent years tracing the Langford genealogy and interviewing aging relatives who were willing to speak only through cracked, frightened whispers. His notes described a family wholly consumed with the preservation of their own blood, convinced that the dilution of their lineage would bring destruction. But buried among these accounts was something far more disturbing, a belief that the family's relentless cousin marriages were not merely an attempt to keep outsiders away, but a deliberate act meant to produce a singular heir. According to Hartwell, early generations of the Langford family believed that with each cousin marriage, the bloodline tightened, memories condensed, and the essence of the ancestors would grow stronger within the unborn. The goal was not purity but containment, a vessel capable of holding the thoughts, instincts, and unfinished desires of those who had come before. In his notes, Hartwell wrote of a phrase he encountered repeatedly in old letters and journals: "One will carry the many." He dismissed it at first as religious metaphor until he observed how often it appeared in contexts describing strange behaviors among the children of earlier generations. One child claimed to dream in languages they had never learned. Another drew maps of lands they had never visited. Some spoke of strangers they recognized from centuries-old portraits. Hartwell began to fear that the family believed their lineage could compress itself into a final human form, something no longer bound by natural limitations. His last entries grew frantic, his handwriting jagged. He wrote that the Langfords were not guarding tradition, they were cultivating something. He urged anyone who discovered his notes to keep their distance from the family should such an heir ever be born. These warnings ended abruptly, the final page torn halfway through a sentence. Hartwell vanished shortly after, leaving only the chilling implication that he had uncovered too much of the truth. The mirror test was never meant to be a test at all. It happened on an ordinary morning when the child was barely 3 years old, though by then everyone in the Langford household had long accepted that nothing about the child was ordinary. It had begun walking before 8 months, speaking in full sentences before its first birthday, and showing a disturbingly analytical awareness of the world around it. But the mirrors in the house had always remained covered, not out of superstition, but because the elders feared that the child's reflection, its true reflection, might reveal something they were not prepared to confront. Still, accidents have a way of happening in even the most guarded homes. On that morning, the youngest aunt had uncovered a small standing mirror in her room to wipe away the dust. She turned her back only for a moment to fetch a cloth. When she turned back, the child was already there, standing inches from the polished glass. She froze, watching the child tilt its head slowly, a smile creeping across its face. But the smile was not what frightened her. It was the reflection itself. The child in the mirror smiled first. The real child, the one standing in front of the mirror, followed a second later, its expression mirroring the reflection rather than the other way around. The aunt felt her body lock up, a cold wave washing through her as she realized what she was seeing was impossible. The reflection blinked at an irregular rhythm, as if studying her, while the real child continued staring into the glass with unsettling fascination. When she took an instinctive step backward, the reflection's eyes shifted to her immediately, but the child outside the mirror didn't move at all. The aunt called for the mother, her voice barely rising above a trembling whisper. Footsteps hurried down the hall, followed by gasps as more family members witnessed the same horror. The elders arrived last, their faces turning ashen. None of them approached the mirror. They simply stood in the doorway, watching the impossible unfold as though they had known this moment might come, but prayed it never would. The reflection began to move its lips, forming silent words, while the actual child remained completely still. A faint fog spread inside the glass surface, like breath from an unseen mouth, even though the child wasn't exhaling. Then, slowly, the reflected head turned, away from the child, away from the family, facing toward the far corner of the mirrored room, staring at something invisible to them all. The aunt reached forward on instinct, wanting to pull the child away, but the elders stopped her with a sharp hiss, insisting that breaking the moment might be dangerous. The reflection finally smiled again, a wide, knowing curl that lingered long after the child's face went blank. When the mirror was finally covered again, the room felt colder, heavier, as if something had been invited in or awakened. From that day onward, no one in the Langford home allowed the child near a mirror. But every night, the sound of faint, muffled whispering echoed from behind the cloth-draped glass, as though the reflection had learned how to speak back. The family gathering was meant to be a celebration, or at least that was the story the elders told to ease the tension that had been building like pressure beneath the floorboards of the old Langford house. By the time the child turned 4, it had outgrown every definition of normalcy, and the family lived in a constant state of silent dread. Still, tradition was tradition, and the gathering had been held for 10 generations before, marking the moment when the heir was presented to the extended bloodline. Relatives who had long avoided the estate arrived reluctantly, drawn by obligation and fear of the elders' wrath. They sat stiffly in the dim dining hall, lit by candles that flickered strangely, as if reacting to a draft no one could feel. Conversations were hushed, strained, and filled with the unspoken truth that everyone sensed. Something in the house had changed. When the child finally entered the room, every sound died instantly. It walked, not toddled, its movements too controlled, too graceful for a 4-year-old. Its eyes scanned the gathering slowly, studying each face with a cold curiosity that made several cousins avert their gaze. The child's presence made the air feel thicker, almost electric. As it reached the center of the room, it smiled. The smile was small, but it held a depth of awareness that felt ancient. The mother tried to pull the child closer to her side, but the elders insisted it be allowed to meet the family on its own terms, a phrase that unsettled everyone who heard it. The first disappearance happened shortly after dinner. A distant cousin, Marybeth, stepped outside to clear her head from the oppressive atmosphere. She never returned. Her coat was later found neatly folded on the porch, but there were no footprints leading away from the house despite the soft, fresh soil. The elders insisted she must have taken a walk and lost her way, though no one believed it. Before sunrise, another relative vanished, this time an uncle who had been seated near the child during dinner. His chair was tipped slightly, as if he had stood up mid-motion, but there were no signs of struggle. Panic began to take hold, but the elders silenced everyone with a warning tone that carried the weight of centuries. Stay calm. The air knows what it's doing. The child was found sitting alone in the parlor, humming a tune no one recognized. When questioned, it simply looked up with those dark, unfathomable eyes and said in a soft voice, "They went home." The mother, trembling, asked where home was. The child pointed to its own chest and smiled, a slow, deliberate smile that crept across its face like a shadow spreading across a wall. The remaining relatives refused to sleep, huddling together in groups, but it made no difference. By dawn, 3 more chairs were empty. The elders tried to maintain control, insisting that this was the natural progression of what had been foretold, but the fear in their eyes betrayed them. The gathering had not been a celebration. It had been a harvest, and the air had begun claiming what it believed already belonged to it. The break of lineage began with a single act of desperation, committed by someone who had lived their entire life believing they were powerless. It was the child's mother, a woman who had spent years suffocating under the weight of the elders' expectations, watching her baby transform into something that was no longer hers. She had seen the disappearances during the gathering, watched relatives vanish without a trace, felt the air in the house grow heavier as if the walls themselves were absorbing the missing. Every instinct in her body screamed to run, to save what little humanity might still remain in her child, but the elders' control over the estate had always been absolute. Yet something shifted on a night when the wind howled through the pines with an unnatural rhythm, and she finally understood that if she didn't act, none of them would survive what the family had created. Her opportunity came when the elders were performing one of their whispered rituals in the great room, their low chanting vibrating through the floorboards like distant thunder. The child sat in the corner, watching them with an expression far too calm for a 4-year-old, its fingers tapping an intricate rhythm against its leg as though following a pattern only it could hear. The mother approached it quietly, pretending to straighten its shirt, pretending to be the obedient daughter the elders believed she still was. But her hands trembled with a mix of fear and resolve as she slipped a small, folded piece of parchment into the child's pocket, something she had found earlier that day hidden inside the back lining of an old trunk. It was a letter written by Elias Hartwell before he disappeared, warning that the bloodline could be severed only through an act of defiance by someone born within it. A single ancestor breaking the cycle willingly would create a fracture the lineage could not repair. The mother did not fully understand the ritual described in the letter, but she knew it required 2 things: courage and timing. When the chanting reached its crescendo, she took the child's hand and pulled it toward the front door. The elders reacted instantly, their voices rising in fury, but the storm raging outside seemed to respond to her will. The wind slammed against the house, rattling the windows, extinguishing candles in a violent sweep. The floorboards buckled underfoot as if the house itself was trying to stop her. The child didn't resist. It simply watched her with a curious tilt of its head, as though evaluating whether this was fear, love, or something else entirely. When they reached the threshold, the child whispered, "Mother, they will come for you." But she didn't turn back. She stepped into the storm, clutching the child to her chest as the sky split open with a white flash that lit the entire estate. Behind her, the ancestral house groaned like a living thing, the chants dissolving into screams as the storm swallowed their voices. The act was simple, a mother choosing her child's survival over her family's legacy. But in that moment, she succeeded in doing what 10 generations before her had failed to even attempt. She broke the chain, shattered the prophecy, And for the first time in 2 centuries, the Langford bloodline felt the first irreversible crack tearing through its foundation. The storm did not simply end when the mother fled the estate with her child. It lingered unnaturally over the valley, suspended like a living thing unwilling to release its grip. For days the sky churned with low, rumbling clouds as though the atmosphere itself resisted the break in the bloodline. The mother hid in an abandoned caretaker's cabin several miles from the Langford property, surviving on canned food and the old well behind the house. She kept the windows covered, terrified that even the faintest glow of lamplight might guide the elders to her. But on the fourth night, the storm abruptly broke, not into calm, but into a chilling stillness that seemed to swallow every sound. When she stepped outside, the air felt hollow, emptied. The pines stood motionless. Even the insects had gone silent. She knew then something had happened at the estate, something final. When she mustered the strength to return, she found the Langford house in ruins. It hadn't been burned, nor struck by falling trees. Instead, the structure looked as if it had collapsed inward, as though the center of the house had been consumed by a force that pulled the walls and beams into itself. The rooms she once knew were now piles of crushed timber, shattered windows, and tangled metal. The great room, where the elders had stood chanting just days before, was little more than a dark crater filled with ash-like dust. There were no bodies. Not a fragment. Not a bone. It was as if the family had simply been erased. The mother clutched the child tighter to her chest, her heart pounding as she tried to understand what could have caused such devastation. But the devastation was only the beginning. As she moved through what remained of the estate, she began to feel an unnatural heat radiating from the ground beneath her feet. The soil was warm, almost feverishly so, and the trees surrounding the property had twisted in strange directions, their branches contorting as if trying to pull away from the center of the house. Something had ruptured beneath the earth. The air shimmered faintly over certain patches of ground, bending light the way heat rises from asphalt. The mother realized she was standing on the remains of something ancient and volatile, something the family had been holding together for generations without understanding the consequences of their rituals. The child, normally calm and observant, clung to her with unusual tension. For the first time since its birth, fear flickered across its face. It looked toward the ruins with wide, dark eyes, whispering. They fell inside themselves. The words sent a cold ripple through her, but before she could question the child further, a deep, distant rumble echoed beneath the earth. The soil vibrated lightly, as if something massive was shifting far below the surface. The mother knew then that the collapse of the family was not the end of the horror, but the beginning of something awakened by the fracture she had caused. Something the bloodline had been containing for centuries had finally found space to stir, and the land itself now carried the pulse of whatever had been freed. The final revelation came gradually, creeping into the mother's awareness like shadows stretching at dusk, until there was no denying the truth that had been concealed for generations. After escaping the ruins of the Langford estate, she tried to convince herself that the nightmare had ended, that the storm, the disappearances, the twisted history, had been confined to the walls of that cursed house. Yet the child had not changed, and neither had the unsettling presence that seemed to cling to them both, invisible yet palpably close. As they traveled, the mother began to notice subtle signs in the world around them. Birds circling overhead in strange patterns, shadows in the trees that moved independently of the wind, and reflections in glass that didn't quite match reality. Each observation brought an uneasy realization. Whatever had been born from 10 generations of obsession had not been destroyed, it had been transformed. The child, once human in the most basic sense, began to show signs of evolution that defied logic. Its body, though still small, radiated a strength that seemed disproportionate to its age. Limbs lengthened and muscles shifted with an eerie precision, as though following a pattern written into its very bones. The mother watched, powerless, as the eyes she had once believed human darkened, deepening to an inky black that reflected not light, but an entire internal landscape she could not comprehend. At night, the child murmured in languages she did not know, recounting memories of ancestors it had never met and deeds it could not possibly have witnessed. The voices were not separate but layered, overlapping, 11 generations compressed into a single consciousness that spoke through a mouth too small for the weight of what it carried. It was then she realized the terrifying truth. The Langford lineage had never been about survival or human perfection. It had been a vessel, a mechanism to contain something that exceeded humanity itself. Every cousin marriage, every ritual, every ledger entry was designed to concentrate the bloodline into a single heir capable of carrying more than just genetics. The child was no longer simply a human descendant. It was a repository of ancestral essence, a living conduit for something that had accumulated knowledge, hunger, and instinct over centuries. The disappearances, the unnatural events, the whispers and shadows, they were all signs of the boundaries between this world and the one the family had been keeping at bay. The heir did not merely inherit the family's history. It embodied it, wore it like a skin, and could reach into the echoes of the past in ways the living could not endure. The mother began to understand that the child's existence was not an anomaly. It was the inevitable result of 10 generations of calculated obsession. Nature had not been defied. It had been accelerated, redirected, and concentrated. The heir was evolution, but not human evolution as anyone understood it. The being they had brought into the world carried within it all the ambitions, fears, and unfinished business of every Langford ancestor, and with each passing day, it grew more aware, more complete, more something else entirely, something not meant to exist.